Welcome to the quiet world of dreams.
Tonight, as you settle into a comfortable position, imagine that you are approaching a small shoreline. North Carolina is almost invisible ahead of you. The sea is restless, the wind is pushing against the boats, and the men around you have already lost several companions to the water. Somewhere beyond the waves lies Roanoke Island, where an English settlement was left 3 years earlier. John White is standing among the sailors. He does not know what he will find when the sun rises. He only knows that his daughter, his son-in-law, and his granddaughter were living on this island when he sailed away. His granddaughter, Virginia Dare, would be 3 years old on this very day. As the boats move closer to the shore, someone notices a light among the trees. A fire is burning in the distance. They play familiar English songs, hoping that someone in the settlement will recognize them. When daylight finally reaches the island, they discover that the fire is not a signal. Grass and several old trees are burning quietly near the shore. There are footprints in the sand, but they do not lead White to the people he has crossed the Atlantic to find. Iron bars, pieces of lead, and several heavy weapons lie among grass and weeds, but the colonists' boats and smaller cannon are gone. On a tree near the path, 3 letters have been carved into the bark. Farther inside the settlement, on one of the main posts beside the entrance, another word appears in large capital letters: Croatoan. It has often been described as a mysterious message left by people who vanished without warning. Yet John White did not see it that way. Before leaving the colony in 1587, he had agreed on a simple system with the settlers. If they moved before he returned, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or a wooden post. There was no cross above Croatoan. White therefore believed that the colonists had moved voluntarily and that they were living with, or near, the Croatoan people on the island now known as Hatteras. Croatoan was both the name of a community and the name used for the place where that community lived. It was also the homeland of Manteo, one of the indigenous men who had worked closely with the English. For White, the carving was not a warning. After 3 years of fear and uncertainty, he believed that he finally knew where his family had gone. He never reached Croatoan. Weather, damaged equipment, and the decisions of the ship's commanders prevented the expedition from continuing its search. The ships were pushed away from the coast, and White eventually returned to England. He never saw Virginia Dare grow older, and because no surviving English expedition is known to have reached the Croatoan community while the colonists were still alive, the message remained unconfirmed. Over time, the unfinished search became a legend. To understand what probably happened at Roanoke, we need to move away from the empty settlement for a while. We need to return to the years before the carving, when English ships first appeared along these shores. The story did not begin with people disappearing. During the late 16th century, England and Spain were competing for influence across the Atlantic. A settlement on the North American coast could serve as a base for ships attacking Spanish trade. He financed and organized expeditions from England, relying on sailors, soldiers, investors, navigators, and local knowledge gathered during the voyages. In 1584, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow led an expedition to the coast of present-day North Carolina. They also brought 2 indigenous men to England, Manteo from the Croatoan community and one cheesy, associated with Roanoke. The world the English entered was not empty. Carolina Algonquian communities had lived in the region for many centuries. To the English, the coast appeared to be a possible beginning. To the people already living there, the arrival of the ships introduced a new and unpredictable presence. This first settlement was mainly a military operation and was very different from the family colony John White would later govern. Several hundred soldiers and sailors crossed the Atlantic, although only a smaller group remained on Roanoke Island. Among the expedition were Thomas Harriot, who studied the region and its languages, and John White, who created detailed watercolors and maps. They are valuable historical records, although they must also be understood as the work of an English observer connected to a colonial project. The colonists had expected to explore, build, and wait for supplies. The English depended increasingly on trade with nearby communities. During an expedition on the mainland, a silver cup was reported missing after the English visited the village of Aquascagok. It also revealed a problem that would follow the English throughout the Roanoke experiments. They needed indigenous communities for food, geographical knowledge, and survival. Yet their military leaders often responded to uncertainty with violence. Disease introduced through contact with Europeans also affected local communities. Although the English did not understand germs or transmission in modern terms, indigenous observers noticed that sickness sometimes followed English visits. By 1586, relations between Ralph Lane's settlement and the Roanoke leader Wingina, also known as Pemisapan, had collapsed. Lane believed that an attack was being planned against the English. Soon afterward, a fleet commanded by Sir Francis Drake arrived near Roanoke. Drake had been operating against Spanish possessions and ships in the Caribbean. He offered assistance to the struggling settlers, but a powerful storm scattered part of his fleet and damaged the supplies intended for Roanoke. The first colony was abandoned, and the settlers sailed back to England. When another English commander, Richard Grenville, arrived later with supplies, he found the settlement empty. To maintain Raleigh's claim to the island, Grenville left a small group of about 15 men behind. The exact details are uncertain, but later accounts suggested that they had been attacked after conflicts created during the earlier colony. When John White's settlers arrived in 1587, they found only the bones of one member of the garrison. The colony of 1587 was supposed to be different. He knew the region from the earlier expedition and had helped document its coast. The settlers planned to establish what they called the city of Raleigh, farther north, near Chesapeake Bay. Roanoke was meant to be a temporary stop. The ships would check on the small garrison left by Grenville, perhaps collect useful supplies, and continue north toward land believed to be more suitable for a permanent settlement. In July 1587, however, the expedition's pilot, Simon Fernandez, refused to transport the colonists farther along the coast. The settlers were left at Roanoke. They stepped ashore beside the remains of a failed military colony in a place where relations with nearby communities had already been damaged. The men who had previously defended the site were missing or dead. The settlers began repairing the abandoned houses and fortifications. We do not have personal diaries from most members of the colony, so we should be careful about describing their private feelings. The wooden structures left by the earlier settlement had been exposed to weather and neglect. Across the Sounds were communities whose memories of English violence were still recent. Only a few days after the colonists arrived, George Howe, one of White's assistants, left the settlement to collect shellfish. Manteo helped the English learn what had happened. The attack was connected to the earlier conflicts involving the soldiers left on Roanoke. The colonists attempted to retaliate against the people they believed responsible. Instead, in the confusion of an early morning attack, they struck members of a friendly Croatoan group. The English had harmed the very community most likely to assist them. Later, an effort was made to repair the relationship. Manteo remained closely connected to the settlers and was formally baptized into the Church of England. On August 18, 1587, John White's daughter Eleanor gave birth to a girl. The child was named Virginia Dare. She was the first child known to have been born in North America to English parents. At the time, however, she was simply a newborn in a vulnerable settlement. The colony needed supplies. The ships that had brought the settlers were preparing to return to England. At first, John White did not want to leave. His family was on Roanoke, and he was the governor. The settlers, nevertheless, asked him to return to England on their behalf. A written statement dated August 25th declared that the request came from the colonists and that White had resisted it before finally agreeing. He left 117 settlers behind. Among them were his daughter, his granddaughter, his son-in-law, craftsmen, laborers, families, and children whose later lives have almost completely disappeared from written history. Before White departed, the settlers discussed the possibility of moving. According to his later account, they were preparing to relocate about 50 miles toward the mainland. Other historical summaries indicate that the colonists intended to divide, with one group remaining connected to Roanoke and another moving inland in search of a safer or more sustainable location. The message system was agreed upon during this period. This detail matters because it changes the scene White discovered in 1590. The carving was not an improvised final message created during an unknown emergency. It followed a plan established before he left. The dismantled houses also fit a deliberate move. The colonists had not simply walked away from complete homes. Heavy objects with limited value during travel remained behind. More portable weapons, boats, and equipment had disappeared with the settlers. The colonists had made decisions, gathered what they could use, and left Roanoke for another place. In 1588, the Spanish Armada attempted to invade England, making it extremely difficult for White to obtain a properly supplied relief expedition. Two small ships did leave England in 1588, carrying White and limited supplies. Both ships were damaged in fighting and forced to return. This failure is sometimes reduced to a simple sentence: the Armada delayed White. In reality, the delay reveals the weakness of the entire Roanoke project. The settlers were far away, dependent on private investment and ships whose commanders had other financial interests. By 1590, White was no longer returning with a large rescue fleet. He persuaded a group of privateers traveling toward the Caribbean to take him to Roanoke. They carried no major supply intended to rebuild the colony and no new population ready to support it. White had a narrow chance to learn what had happened. The expedition reached the Outer Banks in August. During the approach, one of the boats overturned. As darkness came, White's group rowed near the island. The fire among the trees gave them hope, at least for a moment. They saw several kinds of footprints in the sand. Then came the letters, CRO, carefully carved into a tree. White recognized them as part of the agreed message. At the settlement, Croatoan appeared on the post without the cross of distress. White found his books damaged by rain, the frames of his pictures and maps decaying, and his armor heavily rusted. He believed that hostile people from the mainland had entered the settlement after the colonists moved away and searched the buried property. What mattered to White was that the Croatoan message remained. He believed his family was alive on the island to the south. The next step seemed simple: sail to Croatoan and search there. The commanders became unwilling to remain near the coast. White tried to continue the search, but he did not control the expedition. White had found a message pointing toward a known place. He understood the message and wanted to follow it. The colonists became lost because the person searching for them could not complete the final part of his journey. What happened after they left Roanoke? The most direct answer begins with Croatoan. The Croatoan people had maintained the strongest relationship with the English. Manteo had traveled to England, served as an interpreter, and worked with both the earlier expedition and White's colony. His connection to both societies made Croatoan a logical place for at least some of the settlers to seek help. The island offered an established community with knowledge of local food, water, seasons, and coastal travel. The colonists would have understood by then that survival without local support was unlikely. The word carved at Roanoke is strong historical evidence that Croatoan was part of their plan. It does not prove that all 117 settlers reached the island safely. It also does not tell us how long they remained there, whether they arrived together, or how their relationship with the community developed. It is not a record of everything that followed. Archaeological work on Hatteras Island has uncovered European objects from the broad period of the Roanoke voyages. Researchers have reported items associated with weapons, metalworking, navigation, and European domestic life, alongside material from indigenous occupation. More recently, investigators connected to the Croatoan Archaeological Society have highlighted small flakes associated with ironworking, known as hammerscale. They argue that such material supports the presence of English metalworkers living among the Croatoan community. The finds are interesting, especially when placed beside the written message at Roanoke. European objects could reach an indigenous settlement through trade, salvage, gifts, or contact with more than one English expedition. The Outer Banks had already been visited by English ships before the 1587 colony. Archaeology can show that contact and exchange occurred. White wrote that the settlers had considered moving about 50 miles toward the mainland. Archaeologists began examining an area in present-day Bertie County, sometimes called Site X. Excavations there uncovered a small collection of objects associated with late 16th century English activity among the remains of an indigenous settlement. Researchers from the First Colony Foundation have argued that the finds support the presence of at least a few Roanoke colonists. Another possibility leads inland. Work has continued in the wider area, including another location called Site Y. The objects are consistent with the period, but the region had been explored by Englishmen before the colony disappeared. It cannot tell us whether it belonged to a member of the 1585 military expedition, a traveler, a trader, or a settler from 1587. Still, the inland evidence matches an important part of the written record. The colonists had discussed moving in that direction. A group of more than 100 people required substantial food. One group might have gone to Croatoan. Another might have moved inland through Albemarle Sound. A few could have remained near Roanoke for a time, maintaining the settlement or waiting for ships. Children grow up speaking the language of the people around them. After one generation, the category recorded in English documents as the colonists may no longer have described a single group at all. They may have become difficult for English observers to recognize. Tree ring research has shown that the years from 1587 to 1589 fell within an exceptionally severe drought in the region. The study described it as the most extreme 3-year drought visible in approximately 8 centuries of reconstructed climate evidence. That does not prove that the colonists died from hunger. It does help explain why food would have been difficult to obtain. The English had limited experience growing crops in this environment. Their own harvests were uncertain, and they relied on trade with indigenous communities. During a drought, those communities also had less food available. Drought can intensify conflicts without leaving a clear archaeological signature. It changes how far people must travel, how much food can be shared, and how communities evaluate unfamiliar guests. The colonists' departure from Roanoke therefore occurred during a period when remaining in one large group would have been especially difficult. Some settlers almost certainly suffered from malnutrition or illness. The Outer Banks are exposed to powerful storms, and hurricanes affected earlier English expeditions. A severe storm could destroy crops, damage boats, contaminate fresh water, and force people to move. Yet the evidence at Roanoke does not look like a settlement suddenly erased by wind and water. White described houses that had been deliberately taken down, not scattered wreckage. A destination had been carefully carved into wood. It may have struck them later, during travel, or at another settlement. There is no direct record confirming such an event. Both were common threats in early colonies, and the drought increased the risk of hunger. If most settlers had died at Roanoke, however, White might have expected graves, bodies, damaged homes, or abandoned equipment of every kind. It is unlikely to have taken all of them at the original settlement in one event. A Spanish attack has also remained part of the discussion. England and Spain were at war, and Spanish officials knew that the English were attempting to establish a base somewhere along the North American coast. In 1588, a Spanish expedition under Vicente González searched parts of the region. The Spanish found signs of English activity near Roanoke, but did not locate the colonists. Their records do not describe the destruction of White settlement. When White returned 2 years later, he saw no evidence of a Spanish assault. Spain had motive to remove an English colony, but motive is not evidence that an attack occurred. The surviving Spanish records make a direct Spanish destruction of Roanoke less convincing than voluntary relocation. Another theory emerged from reports gathered years later at Jamestown. When the English established Jamestown in 1607, they asked local people about earlier English settlers. Stories circulated that some members of the Roanoke Colony had lived with communities near Chesapeake Bay and had later been killed on the orders of the powerful leader Wahunsenacah, commonly known as Powhatan. William Strachey, who served at Jamestown and wrote an account around 1612, recorded a version of this story. Jamestown's leaders believed that earlier English people might still be alive and actively searched for information about them. His information passed through interpreters and people involved in complicated political relationships. English officials also had reasons to portray Powhatan as a threat. Different versions of the story do not always agree on where the settlers lived or who survived. No confirmed graves or settlement belonging to this reported group have been discovered near Chesapeake Bay. The story leaves open the possibility that some colonists traveled north and were later killed, but it cannot establish the fate of the entire colony. When audiences hear the words "lost colony," it is natural to picture 117 people disappearing on the same night. The historical evidence points toward a process rather than a moment. They dismantled their homes, removed their boats, and left a message. After that, different groups may have followed different routes. Some people may have died during the drought. Others may have joined the Croatoan community. A few may have traveled toward Chesapeake Bay. Children born into the colony may have grown up inside indigenous households. From the English perspective, such people had disappeared. From the perspective of the communities receiving them, they may simply have become neighbors, relatives, or useful members of the settlement. The English record ends because English observers were absent. People under pressure do not always behave in the way later observers expect. Roanoke contains several features often found in disappearance legends: isolation, severe weather, a delayed search, and an abandoned settlement. The people at Roanoke told White where they intended to go. The word Croatoan became mysterious partly because later generations separated it from its original context. On its own, carved into old wood, it seems cryptic. Placed beside White's written agreement with the settlers, it becomes much more ordinary. We still do not know who carved the word, on what exact date, or whether every colonist supported the move. We cannot confirm that the person who carved it was still alive when White arrived, nor can we prove that the group remained at Croatoan after leaving the message. We know what John White believed because his account was published. We do not have a written Croatoan account describing the arrival of English families. The Croatoan people had their own histories, memories, and ways of preserving knowledge, but colonization, disease, displacement, and later social disruption damaged the continuity through which those histories might have reached modern researchers. Oral traditions connecting local communities to the colonists have been recorded in later centuries. Others developed long after Roanoke and cannot be independently verified. Names, physical appearance, and family stories have sometimes been offered as proof of descent from the settlers. Researchers do not possess confirmed genetic samples from most of the colonists or from clearly identified descendants against which modern results can be compared. Stored food declined, and the drought limited what could be grown or obtained through trade. At some point, the colony's leaders accepted that Roanoke was no longer sustainable. The group then moved away from the settlement. People often do not know when they are leaving a place for the last time. They may have expected White to arrive later, read the message, and follow. From the shore, boats moved into the sounds. The water was familiar to Manteo and to other local guides. Behind them, the wooden enclosure became smaller among the trees. The settlement was empty, but the colonists were not yet lost. They were traveling toward another chapter, for which the written pages have not survived. At Croatoan, their arrival would have required negotiation. During drought, accepting more than 100 people at once may have been impossible. This alone supports the idea that the colonists separated. The English, in turn, needed nearly everything the Croatoan people knew: where to find fresh water, which plants could be used, when fish moved through the sounds, how storms changed the islands, and which neighboring groups posed danger. Over years, the English language may have become less important for children living among Algonquian speakers. Metal tools remained useful longer, but they too were repaired until their original shapes changed. Objects that archaeologists now classify as English or indigenous may once have belonged to households that no longer fit neatly into either category. This is one reason archaeology at Hatteras is so difficult to interpret. A European object inside an indigenous settlement demonstrates contact. It does not reveal whether its owner considered himself an English colonist, a member of the Croatoan community, or something that English records had no word to describe. Farther inland, a smaller group may have followed the waterways west. The Albemarle Sound provided a route toward fertile land and communities less directly involved in the conflicts around Roanoke. White's map shows that the English had explored and considered this region. The objects found at Site X and Site Y raise the possibility that English people lived for a time within or beside an indigenous village there. No mass grave confirms that the colony was massacred. No shipwreck has been identified as the vessel carrying all the colonists away. No Spanish report claims responsibility for destroying the settlement. No surviving Croatoan record lists the English families who arrived. No archaeological site contains possessions belonging clearly to all 117 people. The absence of a final answer is real. The claim that there was no evidence at all is not. We have the dismantled buildings. We have the missing boats and portable weapons. We have later reports, map clues, and archaeological material from more than one possible destination. The colony left Roanoke deliberately. At least some settlers likely sought safety among indigenous communities. What happened over the following years was different for different people. Roanoke is closer to a room whose contents were carried through several doors by people moving in different directions. John White could not have known how long his absence would last when he stepped onto the ship in August 1587. He might have imagined returning with food, tools, and new settlers. His own belongings remained at Roanoke, suggesting that he did not expect a permanent separation. When he found his ruined books and maps 3 years later, he was looking at objects from a life that no longer existed. These damaged possessions were personal evidence of time. 3 years had passed on the island without him. Yet even in that moment, White did not write as though he had discovered the death of the colony. He believed he had found proof that the settlers had reached Croatoan safely. It is that he understood it and still could not complete the search. Today, Roanoke Island is no longer the isolated place White approached in darkness. The original settlement has also proved difficult to locate completely. Parts of the area may have been lost to water, covered by later occupation, or disturbed before modern archaeology began. The wooden post carrying Croatoan did not survive. We know the words because White recorded them. Without his account, the empty settlement would be far harder to interpret. With it, we can at least stand beside him for a moment on that August morning. Croatoan. Roanoke became a story about people disappearing because disappearance is easier to describe than transformation. The settlers were English when the surviving English record last saw them. If they later joined other communities, changed their clothing, language, and family ties, They became less visible to the categories used by English historians. Perhaps Virginia Dare died very young during the drought. Perhaps she survived and grew up among the Croatoan people. She may have carried only a faint memory of Roanoke, or none at all. A real child lived behind the symbol that later generations created. Her unknown fate is not an empty space for any story we wish to place there. It is simply something history did not preserve. The same is true for Eleanor Dare, Ananias Dare, Manteo, and the other named and unnamed people connected to the colony. Some were settlers. They did not experience Roanoke as a future legend. The known pressures of the period were already powerful enough: drought, isolation, political violence, unreliable supply lines, and the difficulty of keeping a large group alive in an unfamiliar place. They mean that the people involved lived within the same uncertain world that people have always lived in. And somewhere beyond Roanoke, the history divided into paths we can follow only for a short distance. One path moves south toward Hatteras and the Croatoan community. A third appears faintly in the reports collected at Jamestown. Still, the surviving evidence allows one final thought. The people of Roanoke probably did not vanish. The colony vanished as an English settlement. Its buildings were dismantled. Perhaps that is why Croatoan has remained so powerful. On the other side is a world recorded mostly through fragments, pottery beneath the soil, second-hand stories, local traditions, and objects exchanged between communities. The carved word is the last clear message before the record changes form. For John White, it pointed toward his family. For later historians, it points toward the limits of what documents can tell us. And for you, listening quietly now, it can remain what it was on that morning in 1590, a message waiting to be followed. Wind passes through the grass where the old settlement once stood. Nothing answers from the trees, but the silence no longer feels completely empty. The colonists left a trace. We simply arrived too late to follow it all the way. And as this shore slowly fades into darkness, another distant landscape waits beyond it. Far to the north, centuries later, ships will enter the ice in search of a passage across the Arctic. They too will fail to return. Their empty camps, scattered equipment, and messages beneath stone will create another mystery, while the testimony of indigenous witnesses waits for outsiders to listen. For now, Roanoke grows quiet again. The fire among the trees has burned down. The trumpet is silent. Only the water remains, moving gently past the island, beneath a word that history never fully erased. Croatoan.